Hello everyone and welcome to the second part of making this waistcoat. We are making this with the Black Snail's 1890's ladies vest pattern, and the last time we started work on the back side and we did the outside of the front. In this part we will be mostly focusing on the inside of the front and eventually putting everything together. So without further ado, let's get sewing. We clip almost all of the seam allowance off the canvas on all places where the canvas touches the outside of the pattern piece. The first time I had made a mistake here. The pattern mentions behind the seam line, which I interpreted as outside the seam in the seam allowance. It turned out that this had to be cut inside the seam on the pattern piece, so I had to redo this a bit. Next up, the pattern tells me to use bridle tape to attach just behind the roll line. I'm going to use this tape for all of the bridle tape thingy. It's probably not the best tape to use, but it's a case of use what you have, and I have this around. So it asks me to attach the tape behind the roll line, which gives me the impression that it has to touch the actual line. It tells me to put it on quite tightly. So yes, I'm going to pin this and then fell stitch this in place. We can then attach the bridle tape all around the outside of the waistcoat, again using a fell stitch for attaching. On the edge side I made sure to only catch the flat lining so the stitching isn't visible on the outside. On the inside of the bridle tape I made sure to only catch the canvas. We do the same thing for the armholes, this time clipping the bridle tape so it can lay flat. After that we can catch stitch the darts to the interfacing. And after a few weeks of hand stitching we can finally start to attach some more parts together. We have the front facing and the bottom facing that are going to be attached here at the bottom. And something I did have a bit of trouble with is you have the pink mark here and just a generic outside basting line, and it says to align the marks. I assumed that this stitching line had to be on this pink line, but that's not the case. It's actually the outside of the pattern that has to align with this line. We can line this up here, the stitching lines on top of each other, and then the stitching lines should line up nicely. So let's just pin and stitch this together. Then we can stitch the center back of the collar. The entire lining is laid on the outside of the waistcoat, right sides together and stitched. The seam allowances are cut short, taking care to snip off the corners. So apparently I was a bit too enthusiastic in cutting off the seam allowances and notching them, because right now what they would want me to do is to fold it over and to catch stitch it to the inside. However, I have ironed it over, but I'm afraid that if I would stitch this to the inside, there is only such a little tiny bit that it will fray. So I think I'm going to skip this step. Usually if you'd catch stitch it, it would lay a lot flatter once you turn it the right side out. But I'll just take that for granted and continue on as if I would have catch stitched it. But I'm going to skip it, so let's continue with the rest. Now we ended up at a rather tricky bit of sewing. The lining is folded out of the way. We have the front and the back, and the shoulder seams are laid on top of each other, where I make sure to match up the end of this line, so this full end on this bit of basting, and the marking will go on this mark. What it also tells me is to fold this seam allowance over the back. I don't find this making any sense, but it will probably turn out alright in the end, so let's just do that. Fold this over. And now we can sew it from exactly this mark to, well, the end. After actually sewing these shoulder seams, it does make sense what they mean with folding this around the back. Because once this is folded out, the seam allowance automatically turns to the inside, meaning that the armhole seam is also automatically finished. So that's nice. And what we can do then is to trim back the seam allowance. And clip in where it will turn to exactly where I finished stitching. Then we can press the entire seam allowance to the front of the waistcoat. The neckline itself is a slightly bit simpler. We stitch the pieces together, starting and ending right at the points where the previous stitch line stopped. The seam allowance then gets trimmed back and ironed towards the collar, after which it gets catch stitched flat. For the side seam, we repeat the trick done with the shoulder seam. At the top, the front seam allowance is folded over the back, and at the bottom, the entire lining piece is folded over the back. The tiny bit of seam allowance between the front and the lining is also flipped up. Sewing this side seam will also trap the buckle strap in place. Then we can turn the front right side out. On the bottom we roll the seam so it isn't visible on the outside. For the collar part we roll the seam up so it isn't visible when the collar is turned. It is then pressed nice and flat, and yet another set of basting is added to keep the lining in its current place. Then the pattern tells me to fell stitch the loose edge of the facing to the canvas. But I see I might have made a mistake somewhere, because this piece of canvas is not lining up to the lining. So no idea what happened there. I guess I'll just leave this bit loose and start my fell stitching here. Oh well. When I'm wearing this, no one will ever notice that this is not done properly because it's on the inside anyway. No one but you guys will know. To finish the neckline, we clip the corners and fell stitch it in place. For the last raw seam on the armholes, we fold the seam allowance over, clipping it where needed, iron it, and catch stitch it in place. By this time, I think I might even be getting the hang of the stitch. And then, last but not least, we can finally add the last loose piece of fabric, which is the lining. For this, we first fold over all of the seam allowance, iron it flat, and then fell stitch it in place on the inside of the waistcoat. I find this a pretty interesting way of putting it in, but it sort of makes sense. I mean, this way you're not going to see any stitching on the outside, and it's, well, I think it might end up quite neat. After attaching the lining, we can fell stitch it in place. And with this, all the fabric pieces are attached and we can start finishing it up. The next and last actual sewing step of making this waistcoat is to add in the buttonholes and add the buttons. I did a test fit of this waistcoat and apparently it turned out slightly smaller than the mock-up, which means that it doesn't overlap perfectly, as in middle front will not be aligned with mid front. I can align it at the bottom. That's no problem, but at the top you can see where I marked it. This is where the overlap ends instead of, well, it should have ended here or something, with all the buttonholes lining up against each other. That's not going to work because then it would be too small. So what I am going to do instead is I am going to let it overlap in such a way that the bottom lines up nicely. Towards the top it will just lay more like this, so that this part is slightly wider than the bottom. This means that I can just put the buttonholes on here in the regular location, and then I'll just add the buttons in below where they should go. However, as you can see, most of my basting has left me by now. So I can grab the original pattern, and you might be able to see that I folded these lines straight through both buttonholes locations to be able to baste all the lines in previously, so I can actually see which height the buttonholes should be. So if I line it up like this, line up the locations of the basting threads that are still on here, I can actually see that the middle of the buttonholes should be on this line, and then there should be a buttonhole here, 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 and here. So let me just mark that, and then we can start sewing in the buttonholes. There we go, these are the locations of what on the pattern would be the location of the buttons. I have explained my process of making buttonholes before, so I'll just go through it quickly this time. We start by sewing a box the size of the buttonhole, open it up and overcast the edges, and finishing it off with a buttonhole stitch. Because it is a relatively simple task and all the marks are still in the right locations, I'm first going to sew on the buttons on all of these yellow marks. Now that the buttonholes are stitched and, well, the buttons on the other side are also already stitched on, we can overlay one side of the waistcoat on top of the other so it lines up with the 2 pins that I put in here earlier when I was doing the fitting. And now that we know where the buttonholes end up, we can also determine the position of the other buttons that we will sew on this side. So let's also sew all of these buttons on. With the buttons attached, we can then remove all of the basting threads. The very last thing we have to do to finish this waistcoat is to mount the buckle. I chose this buckle because I had this laying around and it was the right width according to the pattern. But I think my straps turned out slightly smaller than anticipated because this is rather loose. So I will mount it right now just to finish it off, but I will probably replace it later, so I'll only mount it with a few stitches. The idea is rather simple. We can slide this through and then I will stitch it in place here, after which we can just slide the other half through, strap this as wide as we want to, and then either leave it like this, or if I strap it more like that, tie a sort of knot in it. I'll have to look it up how to do that properly. But anyway, last step is to mount the buckle, and then the waistcoat is done. All in all, this was another project where I learned a lot, this time mostly about inner tailoring and pretty visible hand stitching. I'm happy with how the waistcoat turned out. It looks really fancy. And with that, I hope you enjoyed watching, and see you next time.